All right, everyone, here we go with the notes for Chapter 10, the rules and regulations of broadcasting. This first video covering the first 3 sections of your notes. First off, the rationale. What are the 2 main rationales for treating broadcasting as a special case where we need to have all sorts of different rules? Well, the first theory is what's called the scarcity theory. It notes that the electromagnetic spectrum, i.e. radio and television broadcasting waves, they're limited. There's only a limited number of aspiring broadcasters that can be served, and that the government must choose from among the potential applicants. There's only so many places on the dial and so much space in the country that we can only have a finite number of broadcasters operating on various frequencies. The spectrum is such a valuable resource that it should not be privately owned. Instead, the airwaves are treated like a public resource. So there is a bit of competition as to who actually gets the right to broadcast. And because of that, the government has to step in and make sure that things are being done in a fair sort of manner and that the airwaves are being used in the best interest of that public resource. The other theory is called the Pervasive Presence theory. It holds that broadcasting is available to virtually all of the population, and once the TV or radio set is turned on, offensive messages can enter the home without warning, reaching both adults and children. And there's a distinction that's made here as it comes to the freedom of speech idea. And that is the idea that the home is not the same as a public place. You should not expect to encounter unwanted, offensive messages in your home. When you're out and about in the public square, walking on the sidewalk, freedom of expression, well, it's an open arena. But as far as the government is concerned, when it comes to television and radio, when you are purposefully dialing that in for the purpose of allowing someone to send messages to you, you should not have to encounter certain types of content that you may find disturbing or offensive in some sort of a moralistic sort of way. It's a little more broader than that. I mean, there are different messages out there and people have opinions, but more dealing in terms of the things that are offensive in an obscene sort of way. Thus, the basic intrusiveness of broadcasting allows the government to regulate it in a much more tuned fashion than as we do messages in freedom of expression out in the public square. A little history for you here. First, a review of Chapter 1. In 1910, the Wireless Ship Act required oceanic passenger ships to be equipped with wireless sets. And then in 1912, the Radio Act required broadcasters to be licensees. They provided for the use of call letters, assigned frequencies, and the hours of operation. And all these things were done prior to the idea of radio being a broadcast medium. It was more just a communication medium, especially with ships talking to ships and things like that. So the government had stepped in, making sure that the various signals would be able to be heard and wouldn't get trounced over each other, and that people were playing by courteous rules to make sure that the airwaves could be used the way that they were intended. Then, as the airwaves started becoming used in a broadcasting sort of sense, we see that in the 20s, there was these issues with interference and that sort of thing going on as people were getting more and more involved with radio. So in 1927, the Radio Act comes about, mitigating signal interference problems. And that's pretty much the crux of the 1927 Act, to try to put some sort of order into what was going on with the airways. But there were some other things that happened in the 1927 Radio Act as well. First off, the public is now who owns the electromagnetic spectrum. That was decided with this particular act. Therefore, radio stations had to operate in the public interest, convenience, or necessity. This is where we get that idea that broadcasters operate in the public interest, that there is something of value to the public with the broadcaster being there and existing. Thirdly, a prohibition against censorship of broadcast programs by the government was put into place. As we're going to see a little later on, it's going to be more about in terms of things that are obscene as opposed to subject matter per se. The government does not control what you can say and not say in terms of a freedom of speech issue, but it has more to do with issues revolving around obscenity and decency. We'll get to that a little later on in the chapter. Fourthly, the 1927 Radio Act created the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission. Now, we fast forward to 1934, the Communications Act replacing the act that was passed in 1927. The major thing that happened here was the replacement of the FRC with the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, broadening the scope of the government entity to encompass all sorts of communications in the present and in the future. One of the things that the FCC did right then and there, in addition to radio, was to include governance over the telephone. So basically, they were setting this up so that the FCC would govern both wired and wireless communication. Now, some various aspects of the 1934 Act include these. Section 301, users of the electromagnetic spectrum must be licensed by the FCC. This is part of the FCC trying to maintain some sort of order in terms of ownership and in terms of allocations and things like that. Allocation of spectrum, that I should say. Section 312, candidates for federal office must be given reasonable access to broadcast facilities. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. Section 315, use of broadcast facilities by candidates for public office is outlined and going into more detail there. And then Section 326, the FCC forbidden to censor the content of radio and TV programming. Some updates throughout history. In 1959, the FCC declares that it's illegal for people to rig quiz shows. And then in 1962 was the passing of the Communications Satellite Act, which basically brought satellite communication under the guise of the FCC. Now, as far as cable regulation goes, originally the FCC didn't really want to touch it. They felt that it wasn't quite the same sort of thing as broadcasting was. However, broadcasters pressured the FCC to stepping in because cable was becoming a bigger competitor to broadcast TV. Before 1984, cable was also highly regulated by state and local governments as well. There were lots of different rules that were put in place by local town governments and county governments, state governments, that cable operators had to comply with. So prior to rules put in place in 1984, the FCC kind of felt, well, they're already regulated and it's not something that we need to deal with. It's not really within our scope. But then, of course, that changes. Deregulation in the 1980s. The FCC abolishes many regulations that pertain to radio, simplified license renewal applications, and then eased operating regulations for TV stations. And this is a trend that we see happen with FCC rules as we go from this point forward. In 1984, Congress extended the license terms for both radio and TV stations, and then they also passed the Cable Communications Policy Act, which allowed cable systems the freedom to set their own rates. So with this, we're starting to see where cable is getting a little more freedom from some of the regulations that were put on them with the combined pressure of the broadcasters with the FCC, and then also with state and local governments. Cable getting a little more freedom here in 1984. Fast forward to 1996, the Telecommunications Act. One of the main goals of the act was to foster competition between cable companies and phone companies in hopes of providing consumer choice, better service, and lower bills. This is where you start to see various companies kind of intermixing in terms of the various services that they offer. Companies that were traditionally phone companies now beginning to offer internet service as well as cable type of service where you can get cable channels through your phone company. And cable companies kind of doing the same thing in reverse. They're also providing internet services, and now they're also offering phone services, which was out of their realm previously. Net neutrality. We'll talk very briefly about this. This is something that the book doesn't get a chance to go into in detail because a lot of the developments in net neutrality happened within the past 10 years. So it's kind of past when the book was published. In a very simple sense, net neutrality is the idea that internet service providers should be prohibited from being able to exercise data discrimination. And that's the idea of blocking or inhibiting access to certain content or to certain competitors' sites. And it's still very hotly debated here in the United States. There's various rules against this in European countries. Net neutrality was a thing in the United States between 2015 and 2018. It was repealed in 2018. However, the issue continues to be debated. Some other impacts of the 1996 Telecommunications Act. In large markets, one organization can now own as many as 8 radio stations. Prior to this, they could own 1 AM and 1 FM. These changes prompted a wave of consolidation in the radio industry. This is where you start to see the development of many of these huge corporations that now own hundreds and hundreds of radio stations across the U.S. As far as television goes, one person or organization can now own as many stations as they want, as long as the combined reach of the stations does not exceed 39% of the nation's homes. So there's not a cap into the number of stations that can be owned. Generally, per market, a company can own 2 stations, but it's unlimited throughout the country, again, as long as your reach is not more than 39% of the U.S. population. The law also extended the license renewal term to 8 years for both radio and television stations. The law further gave cable systems more leeway in setting the rates they charge their subscribers, a change that resulted in higher bills for cable subscribers, not surprisingly. And finally, the act required new television sets to be equipped with a V-chip. This is a device that enables parents to control access to programs that they consider objectionable. So this is now pretty much a standard feature in televisions that you buy today. Now, various regulatory forces control what goes on in the world of television and radio. The big one would be the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Members of the FCC are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. And the FCC has within it 7 different bureaus. They're all listed in your textbook, but the most important one to us is the Media Bureau. The Media Bureau oversees AM and FM radio, broadcast TV, cable, and satellite services. Now, there are other players in determining what happens in the world of broadcasting, one of which is Congress. Congress, they're the guys that established the FCC. They also reauthorized its existence every 2 years. Some of the legislation that Congress has passed that impacts broadcasting includes the Communications Act of 1934 and the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Some other things that they had set forth in 1969, they passed laws that prohibited cigarette advertising on television and radio. And then in 1990, they passed a law that concerned children's television programming. We'll talk a little bit more about children's television later in the chapter. Some other controls Congress has, they set the budget for the FCC so they can hold the purse strings and try to pressure things to happen or not happen in terms of the money that's released. They also confirm presidential appointments and they hold public hearings concerning issues that could greatly affect the FCC. As far as the courts go, more cases concerning broadcasting are pretty much decided by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, whose decisions are subject to review only by the Supreme Court. So because of the nature of broadcasting being a federal public resource, there's not that many steps in the judicial system. It goes to the Court of Appeals in D.C. and then to the Supreme Court. It was a court decision that articulated the pervasive presence rationale behind broadcasting regulation and affirmed the FCC's right to regulate indecent programming. So we talked about pervasive presence at the beginning of this video. We'll talk a little bit more about indecency later in the chapter. Another regulatory force, the White House. The president has the power of appointment over both FCC commissioners and judges. He or she can set the regulatory tone of the FCC by the appointments that he or she makes. The types of people that are put in there by the president. Basically, the president has the power to pick people and try to figure out what sort of temperament, what sort of way they would lean in terms of making policy. And that is one of the benefits of the presidency. The White House has its own agency that specializes in the broad field of telecommunications. This is separate from the FCC, and it's called the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. What is the role of the NTIA? Well, they allocate radio frequencies that are used by the federal government. They make grants to public telecommunications facilities. They advise the administration on telecommunications matters, and they represent the administration's interests before the FCC and Congress. So that is the NTIA. Some other things about the White House and its impact on broadcasting. Cabinet offices can also influence broadcasting and cable policy by various means and methods. The White House can influence policy by initiating communication legislation as well. The president has the power to be able to present a law for consideration to both houses of Congress and have the legal process work in that way. Industry lobbyists, another group of folks that have an impact on broadcasting. What is a lobbyist? A lobbyist is a person who represents a special interest and tries to influence legislators' voting behavior. Now, many times when we talk about lobbyists, they tend to be talked about in a rather negative sort of way, but they can also be a positive force. They help the lawmaker learn about the impact of pending bills on various segments of society. So those that have a vested interest in a certain industry, can speak up and let their representatives and senators know what sort of impacts and feelings and reactions of that certain segment of the population, and try to get those representatives to keep those things in consideration as they're talking about laws and that sort of thing. The broadcasting and cable industries maintain extensive lobbying organizations. Various broadcast associations have been put together, many of them just interested in broadcasting in general, serving the various stations across the country. There's also groups that have certain agendas when it comes to broadcasting, groups like the Family Research Council and the National Association of Broadcasters, for example, National Religious Broadcasters as well. And then the networks themselves also have lobbying groups that work on their behalf. The public, also a regulatory force. Some public interest groups act as lobbyists, and the public influences policy in a general way through elections, i.e., voting. State and local governments also have their hand into the fray. Many states have legislation that covers areas not specifically touched on in federal communications law. These are things concerning defamation, lotteries, misleading advertising. Also, broadcasters must comply with local law governing taxation and working conditions. And not listed in the book, there would also be issues concerning zoning laws, because if you're a broadcaster, that means you have a broadcast tower, which means you have to have land to put that broadcast tower on. So zoning rules are going to apply there. Real estate taxes, all those sorts of things. So you have state and local government involvement. And finally, you have the marketplace itself. In this circumstance, the marketplace notion refers to general economic forces like supply and demand, also competition, price. All these things shape the broadcasting and cable industries. It is a business, after all. The marketplace has its advantages. It can promote efficiency, encourage the creation of new services, and encourage diversity. But on the negative side, the marketplace is only responsive to economic forces and is generally not as sensitive to social needs, which can be an issue, as the FCC has very clearly stated that broadcasters need to operate in the local interest, and sometimes that interest can go head-to-head against profitability and the interests of business in general. So this is a good place for us to take a break. We will continue on with section 4 of the notes over at part B of chapter 10.